President Joe Biden today at the UN urges the world to stand firm in support of Ukraine's fight against Russian invasion. Biden called for the world to stand up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, calling for leaders to stand firm in their support of President Zelensky and his nation as the war heads towards its second autumn. For insight into this, let's turn to our first guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So President Biden said that President Putin and his armed forces are betting that the world will grow weary of supporting Ukraine, and it is incumbent upon the countries in the United Nations to stand firm against President Putin's aggression. Quote, "If we allow Ukraine to be carved up, is the independence of any nation secure? I respectfully suggest the answer is no. We have to stand up to this naked aggression today and deter other would-be aggressors tomorrow," Biden said. Well, I guess he was talking to himself because, and this is what I think we would call a projection. We would also call this, I mean, there are a lot of, I guess, very nice ways I could put this, but the world will grow weary of supporting Ukraine, but the United States started to fight, Joe. So, Dr. Horne, help me out here, because Biden's rhetoric doesn't match reality.
That should be surprising only to those who do not pay attention. Recall that quite famously, the former Pentagon chief and head of the CIA, Robert Gates, said during the first Biden presidential run, 2019-2020, that he had been wrong virtually on every foreign policy issue in recent years. I dare say that that equation has yet to change. Recall also, to the point of what he was accusing Moscow of, it reminded me of that old saying that those who point the finger of accusation have three fingers pointed back at themselves. And I thought immediately of what Mr. Biden proposed in the early years of the 21st century when the second Bush regime invaded Iraq. And of course, Mr. Biden said that, yes, Iraq should be cut up into various pieces. It should be balkanized further, actually exacerbating the disaster that Mr. Bush #2 had led the country into. However, if I had more sympathy for an aging senior citizen, I would sympathize with the plight of Mr. Biden, who, after all, is facing an impending impeachment inquiry. Polls suggest that the race is tightening between him and his presumed opponent, Mr. Trump. Increasingly important bigwigs, such as David Ignatius of the Washington Post, are requesting that he drop out of the race. And likewise, according to the New York Times, he has lingering resentment towards his predecessor, Mr. Obama, since supposedly Mr. Obama counseled him in 2016 not to challenge Hillary Rodham Clinton in her disaster of a race to defeat Mr. Trump. But it would have been well if Mr. Biden in 2020, 21, 22, not to mention today, had heeded the counsel of Mr. Obama, who warned that in any conflict with Ukraine, Russia would maintain, quote, escalatory dominance, unquote. And that is what has been unfolding as we speak. In any case, at his United Nations speech, Mr. Biden somehow managed to track the disastrous words of his Secretary of State, speaking of Anthony Blinken, who a few days ago spoke to an elite and waiting audience at Johns Hopkins University. War criminals on training wheels is another way to look at them. And in some ways, this was a bleak speech by a myrmidon of U.S. imperialism, speaking of Mr. Blinken, because he conceded what we've been arguing for in recent days, weeks, perhaps months, that yes, we are in a multipolar world, but Mr. Blinken then leaped to the disastrous notion that somehow U.S. imperialism can confront Russia and China simultaneously. First of all, it's unclear if that's possible. Second of all, it's unclear if the European Union, essential to this titanic battle, will be on board. That may be one of the reasons why Mr. Macron chose not to arrive at the United Nations session in New York, because he did not want to confide this council to Mr. Biden. Recall that it was not so long ago that both Berlin and Paris sent their heads of state and government with plane loads of businessmen to China to try to broker deals. At the same time, we see that in a recent meeting between Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, that it was a virtual love fest. If I didn't know better, I would think something else was going on. In any case, they're preparing for what will inevitably be a triumphant visit of Mr. Putin to China within months, which will be a further evidence that, yes, we are in a multipolar world. And no, Mr. Blinken, no, Mr. Biden, you have embarked on the wrong path. Another meeting to look toward is the meeting of Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference in San Francisco in a few weeks. The question is, will Mr. Xi Jinping show up across the Pacific, or will he continue his previous pattern of dodging Mr. Biden as if he were a process server or a spurned lover, because he does not want to deign to speak to this man who is embarked on a wrong path. And then, of course, there is the supplicant of U.S. imperialism, speaking of Mr. Zelensky, who will be showing up in New York and in Washington, begging bowl in tow. He will be receiving a lukewarm welcome at best. I'm sure you saw the article in the New York Times suggesting that an alleged Russian attack on a Ukrainian marketplace might have been friendly fire from Ukrainian forces.
Yes.
I think that in a sense, was softening up Mr. Zelensky for the inevitable, which is that if you look at the votes in Congress, support for this U.S. escapade is rapidly diminishing. And combined with the poll numbers of Mr. Biden, the impeachment hearing, it's unclear whether the Congress will be able to move forward with more billions for that collapsing regime. And speaking of the collapsing regime, I trust that you and your crack news team will investigate the latest story, which is that the Czech Republic is spurning the request of Mr. Zelensky to return thousands of draft dodgers to Ukraine. The question is, how many draft dodgers from Ukraine are in the United States of America? And what has been the response of the U.S. authorities? Are they sending back these young men to a certain death? We await an investigation by Sputnik.
A couple of things we'll put together. As all of that unfolds, Washington Post reports anxiety ripples through the Democratic Party over Biden. Now, they keep talking about Biden's age, but, you know, Wilmer and I, and we all discuss it. We know they can't come out and say it is his cognitive decline, so they have to say age. But as all of this goes on, we've heard today that Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister of Russia, he will be meeting with Iran's military on Thursday in Iran. Bashar al-Assad from Syria, he's going to meet with President Xi, apparently, at President Xi's request. All kind of things happening, and Joe Biden's facing impeachment, and anxiety is rippling through his party, as they say. Your thoughts on all of that, Dr. Horne?
And just quickly, this is the first time in the articles that I've seen about this issue. Not only did they say age, But in this article, they say age and energy. So they're adding another element beyond age that, as far as I could discern, they hadn't added before.
And Trump's going to Detroit to talk to the United Auto Workers, and he's not. Anyway, Dr. Horne.
Well, speaking of low energy, recall that it was in 2015, 2016 that candidate Donald J. Trump wielded that claim of low energy like a cudgel against then contender Jeb Bush, the erstwhile governor of Florida, and it helped to sink Mr. Jeb Bush's poll numbers, forcing him into a premature retirement. Perhaps Mr. Biden will suffer a similar fate. With regard to United Auto Workers, there was a striking article in the New York Times where a number of workers on the picket line expressed, at best, lukewarm support for the candidacy of Mr. Biden. That is not necessarily the kind of news that the Biden campaign wants to hear. And likewise, if you look at some of the other foreign policy maneuvers of the Biden team, they do not inspire confidence. I'm now turning my attention to what's going on in Armenia, a former Soviet republic, as we speak. Apparently, the conflict with neighboring Azerbaijan is heating up. Historically, Armenia, a predominantly Christian country, was protected, in a sense, by Russia, not only after 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, but even before. And recall that before the Bolshevik Revolution, there was the genocide inflicted on Armenia. Azerbaijan is predominantly Muslim, as you know, and somehow, I'm afraid to say, that the influential Armenian American community, which includes former California Governor George Deukmejian and, of course, the notorious Kardashian family, have whispered in the ear of the authorities in Yerevan, encouraging them to turn towards U.S. imperialism, which can only end in tears. And one more footnote. Recall that notoriously, the rapper and fashion designer, once known as Kanye West, said notoriously that slavery for African Americans was a choice. He, of course, traveled to Armenia with his then spouse, Kim Kardashian. He did not say there that the genocide inflicted more than 110 years ago was a choice by the Armenians. And of course, he too plans to run for president and exhibits the kind of ineptitude that Mr. Biden is making infamous.
I'd like to just close. We were talking about Trump going to Detroit to talk to the unions, and there are advisors in the Biden camp that have suggested that he go, he being Trump, he being Biden, he go and stand on the line with the auto workers. And up to this point, he is refusing to do so. I think that's an incredible, another incredible opportunity missed, Dr. Horne.
Well, obviously, he's worried about the turning off of the spigot of campaign donations from auto executives in Detroit. And therefore, he's decided to spurn the workers. And this is rather strange coming from the self-proclaimed most pro-union president in the history of the United States of America.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis. And we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.